Welcome back to the channel. Today, we are going to take a long and immersive journey into the lives of New York's working poor in the 1800s, focusing on what they actually ate and what daily life was like for the city's most vulnerable residents. When we picture 19th century New York, our minds often drift to images of grand architecture, crowded streets, and the rise of industry, with horse-drawn carriages, merchants calling out in the market, and the smell of fresh bread mingling with smoke from factory chimneys. Yet behind this bustling facade of growth and opportunity, there existed a stark reality, a hidden underworld of poverty, struggle, and survival that rarely appears in history books or photographs. The lives of the poor in New York during this era were shaped not only by their financial constraints, but also by social, political, and economic forces that kept them trapped in a constant battle for survival. To truly understand what they ate, we first need to understand who they were, where they lived, and the conditions that dictated every choice they made. New York in the 1800s was a city of extremes. On one hand, it was rapidly industrializing, attracting merchants, bankers, and wealthy families who were able to enjoy the luxuries of a booming urban economy. On the other hand, it was home to thousands of working-class families, immigrants, and laborers who lived in overcrowded tenements, struggled to find steady work, and faced a daily uncertainty about whether they would have enough to eat. These poor families were the backbone of the city's economy, providing the labor that fueled factories, docks, and construction, yet they rarely reaped the rewards of their hard work. Many were recent immigrants, fleeing famine, political unrest, or economic hardship in their home countries, hoping that the American dream would offer them a chance at a better life. However, upon arrival, they found a city that was not ready to welcome them with open arms. Instead, they found cramped, unsanitary living spaces, harsh working conditions, and food that was scarce, expensive, or unreliable. The physical environment in which these families lived played a critical role in shaping their diets and eating habits. Tenement buildings, which became a defining feature of the city, were often narrow, poorly ventilated, and overcrowded. Entire families, sometimes spanning 3 or 4 generations, lived in a single small apartment, often with only 1 or 2 rooms. Privacy was minimal, hygiene was difficult to maintain, and access to clean water and sanitation was limited. In many cases, families shared a single toilet or relied on communal water pumps, making the spread of disease a constant threat. Cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis were rampant, exacerbated by the lack of proper nutrition and the general physical strain of urban poverty. In this environment, food was not just nourishment, it was a lifeline, a scarce and precious resource that determined whether a family could survive the harsh realities of city life. The social and economic structure of New York also created sharp divides between the rich and poor, which directly affected what people ate. The wealthy could afford to dine on fresh meat, imported fruits, baked goods, and other delicacies, while the poor had to rely on cheap, filling staples that could be purchased in bulk or prepared with minimal ingredients. The cost of food dictated everything. Meat, particularly beef and pork, was expensive, and only the occasional family with slightly higher income could afford it. For most, the primary sources of calories came from bread, potatoes, beans, and rice. These foods were cheap, versatile, and filling, but they provided little nutritional diversity, which had long-term consequences for health and growth, especially among children. Families had to stretch every penny, often buying food in small quantities daily rather than storing larger amounts, because they simply could not afford to stockpile. Immigration played a major role in shaping the dietary patterns of New York's poor. The city saw waves of Irish, German, Italian, and Eastern European immigrants who brought their own culinary traditions and adapted them to what was available and affordable. Irish immigrants, many fleeing the Great Famine, often relied heavily on potatoes and cabbage, creating meals that were simple but filling. German immigrants introduced sausages, sauerkraut, and hearty breads, while Italian immigrants made use of cheap grains like cornmeal and flour to prepare polenta or pasta dishes that could feed an entire family. Despite these cultural differences, the common thread among all these communities was scarcity. Every meal had to be calculated carefully, and nothing could go to waste. Leftovers were often reheated multiple times, and scraps of food were creatively repurposed into soups, stews, or porridges. Childhood in the poor neighborhoods of New York was especially harsh. Many children worked alongside their parents in factories, workshops, or as street vendors, leaving little time for school or play. Breakfast, if it existed, was often minimal: a piece of stale bread, a bit of lard or butter, or a bowl of porridge made from cornmeal or oatmeal. Coffee, which today seems like a morning necessity, was a rare indulgence, sometimes reserved for the adults who needed the energy to work long hours. Children frequently went to school hungry, which affected their ability to learn and grow. The lack of proper nutrition made them more vulnerable to disease and stunted physical development, further entrenching the cycle of poverty. Work also dictated what the poor ate. Laborers in factories, docks, or construction needed food that could keep them energized throughout long, grueling days, but they could not afford luxurious meals. Simple, filling foods that could be eaten quickly were preferred. Porridges, stews, and bread provided the necessary calories, but they lacked variety and essential nutrients. Meals were often repetitive, with the same ingredients appearing day after day, sometimes week after week. Families adapted to this monotony by seasoning food creatively or combining leftovers in new ways, but the underlying scarcity remained a constant challenge. The marketplaces of New York offered some relief, though they were not accessible to everyone. Street vendors, pushcarts, and local markets provided cheap produce, bread, and occasionally meat. However, prices fluctuated, quality varied, and competition was fierce. Many families could only afford food in small amounts each day, forcing them to make difficult decisions about which foods to buy. Potatoes, beans, cabbage, and cheap cuts of meat were staples because they were inexpensive and could feed a family, even if the nutritional value was limited. The poor learned to stretch every ingredient, turning small portions into meals that could satisfy hunger, even if they did not provide pleasure or variety. The broader economic conditions of the 1800s also contributed to the struggles of the poor. Industrialization brought jobs, but it also brought instability. Wages were low, working hours were long, and employment could be unpredictable. Seasonal work, layoffs, or illness could leave a family without income for weeks, making access to food even more precarious. Charity and soup kitchens occasionally helped, but they were not a consistent solution, and many people were forced to rely on ingenuity and community networks to survive. Neighborhoods became tightly knit as families shared resources, bartered for food, and helped one another through times of scarcity. In these communities, food was not just sustenance, it was a social glue, connecting people through shared struggle and mutual support. Despite these hardships, the poor in New York displayed remarkable resilience. They developed strategies to make the most of what little they had, preserving food through drying, pickling, or fermenting, and repurposing scraps into soups or stews. Meals became a test of creativity and resourcefulness. Ingredients were combined in unexpected ways, flavors were enhanced with simple seasonings, and every bite was valued. This ingenuity allowed families to survive under conditions that might seem unimaginable today. Understanding the lives of the poor in 1800s New York requires more than just a look at what they ate. It requires empathy for their struggles, recognition of the social and economic forces at play, and appreciation for their resilience in the face of hardship. Their daily existence was a complex interplay of scarcity, labor, culture, and community. Food was a reflection of all of these factors, and by studying it we gain insight into the broader human experience of urban poverty during this transformative period in history. In the next parts of our exploration, we'll look more specifically at the kinds of foods they consumed, how meals were structured, and the cultural influences that shaped their diets. But even at this stage, it's clear that life for New York's working poor was far from easy. Every loaf of bread, every potato, every bowl of porridge represented a struggle against hunger, disease, and social inequality. These meals, humble though they were essential to survival and a testament to the human capacity to endure in even the harshest conditions. By placing ourselves in the shoes of these families, imagining their mornings, afternoons, and evenings, we can start to understand not only what they ate but why they ate it, and how their diets were intertwined with the social fabric, economic pressures, and cultural landscape of 19th century New York. It is a story of resilience, adaptation, and survival, a story that deserves to be remembered as much as the tales of wealth, power, and progress that dominate history books. For the poor of 1800s New York, every meal was not just nourishment, but a vital, sometimes desperate act of survival. Their diets were dictated not by choice or preference, but by necessity, availability, and cost. In a city that was rapidly industrializing, expanding its commerce and growing in wealth, the poorest residents lived lives of constant uncertainty. Food was expensive relative to income, fresh ingredients were often inaccessible, and every penny spent on groceries had to be weighed carefully against rent, clothing, or medical expenses. The stark contrast between the lavish dinners of the city's elite and the humble meals of the working poor was not just a reflection of economic disparity. It was a daily reality that defined the rhythms of life for millions of families. The diet of the poor was simple, repetitive, and heavily reliant on inexpensive staples. Meat, which today is considered a basic part of most diets, was a rare luxury. Only on rare occasions would a family afford a small portion of salted pork, a piece of beef, or scraps left over from the markets. Instead, they depended on bread, potatoes, beans, and rice, the building blocks of survival. These foods were cheap, calorie-dense, and could be stored for longer periods, making them ideal for families who could not afford to buy fresh food every day. Bread, in particular, was central to nearly every meal. It was eaten plain, sometimes smeared with a small amount of butter or lard if the family could afford it, and often used to soak up soups and stews. Potatoes, a filling and versatile ingredient, were boiled, baked, or mashed, forming the heart of many meals. Beans and rice were prized for their protein content and the ability to stretch a few ingredients into a more substantial dish. Breakfast, the first meal of the day, was often minimal. Many families had little more than a slice of bread or a small bowl of porridge. Porridge was made from cornmeal, oatmeal, or other grains, cooked in water or milk if it was available. Sweeteners such as sugar or honey were rare, so porridge was typically plain or flavored with a small amount of fat or salt. Coffee, a beverage that many of us take for granted as a daily ritual, was a rare luxury for the poor. When it was consumed, it was usually weak and stretched with water to last longer. Adults who worked long hours in factories, docks, or workshops would sometimes save a few sips for themselves, as even a small cup of coffee could provide a necessary boost of energy to face the demanding day ahead. Children, on the other hand, often went without, heading to school or work with empty stomachs. Hunger among children was common, and malnutrition had long-term effects on their growth, learning, and resistance to disease. The structure of meals also reflected the constraints of poverty. Many poor families ate only 2 meals a day, a light breakfast and a more substantial dinner. Lunch, in some cases, was skipped entirely due to work schedules or the unavailability of affordable food. For laborers, the day often began before sunrise and ended long after sunset, leaving little time for leisurely meals. Food had to be practical, portable, and filling. Street vendors and pushcarts offered some relief, providing inexpensive soups, bread, or beans, but these were not accessible to everyone. Families often had to plan their meals around what they could cook at home, using a single stove or fireplace to prepare all their food. Beans were a cornerstone of the poor diet. Dried beans, available in bulk, were inexpensive, filling, and provided essential protein. They could be soaked overnight and boiled into a simple stew, sometimes flavored with scraps of meat or a few vegetables if available. This dish, although bland to the modern palate, was a mainstay because it was cheap, filling, and could be stretched over multiple meals. Beans were often eaten with bread or potatoes, creating a combination that provided both carbohydrates and protein, essential for energy and survival. Rice was another staple, although it was less common than bread or potatoes. It was primarily used in soups or mixed with small amounts of vegetables or meat to extend the quantity of food available. For many immigrant families, rice became an integral part of traditional dishes adapted to the scarcity of the city. For example, Italian families might cook rice with a small amount of tomato or cheese to make it more flavorful, while Eastern European families might use rice to bulk out soups or porridges. These adaptations were necessary to make meager ingredients more satisfying and to ensure that every family member received enough to eat. Bread, however, was arguably the most essential and relied upon food. Loaves were purchased daily if possible, as many families lacked proper storage. Some families baked their own bread when flour was available, but for the majority, buying a few slices or a small loaf each day was the only option. Bread was eaten in its simplest form, sometimes accompanied by a bit of lard, butter, or a smear of jam if it could be afforded. Leftover bread was never wasted. It might be soaked in soup, used to thicken stews, or fried in fat to create a second smaller meal. Even scraps were valued, reflecting the scarcity and careful management of resources that characterized life for the poor. Potatoes were equally important, especially among Irish and German immigrant communities. Potatoes were inexpensive, filling, and versatile, capable of being boiled, mashed, or baked. They could be combined with cabbage, onions, or other inexpensive vegetables to create a more substantial meal. During the winter months, potatoes became even more critical, as fresh vegetables were scarce and expensive. Families often relied on root vegetables and preserved foods to maintain some semblance of nutrition during the cold months, using every available method to stretch their food supplies. Vegetables, aside from potatoes and cabbage, were scarce for the poor. Fresh produce was expensive, and small families often could not afford to buy more than a few items each week. Backyard gardens provided some relief, particularly for families with access to small plots of land, but these were rare in crowded tenement neighborhoods. When vegetables were available, they were usually cooked into soups or stews to maximize flavor and nutrition. The poor learned to use every part of the plant, including stems, leaves, and peels, to avoid waste and ensure that nothing went unused. Meat was the rarest component of the poor diet. A small portion of salted pork, a few scraps of beef, or the occasional chicken was considered a treat rather than a daily necessity. Families often relied on offal, bones, or leftover cuts from wealthier households, creating soups or stews that were nourishing but far from luxurious. Fish was sometimes more accessible, particularly salted herring or cod, but it was still considered a luxury for most families. The rarity of meat in the diet meant that protein intake was often low, contributing to widespread malnutrition and health issues among the urban poor. The poor also had to contend with the challenge of food storage. Refrigeration did not exist, and ice was expensive and difficult to obtain. Perishable foods had to be consumed quickly, which made daily shopping a necessity for many families. In some cases, families stored food in cellars or cool pantries, but these were limited and could not accommodate large quantities. Preservation methods like salting, smoking, drying, or pickling were common, allowing families to extend the shelf life of meat, fish, and vegetables. These techniques, while effective, also affected flavor and texture, making meals less appealing but more practical for survival. Immigrant communities brought their own dietary customs which influenced the poor diet in New York. Irish families relied heavily on potatoes and cabbage, sometimes accompanied by small amounts of meat or fish. German families incorporated hearty breads, sauerkraut, and sausages into their meals when possible. Italian families adapted their traditional dishes, using inexpensive ingredients like cornmeal, pasta, and preserved tomatoes to create satisfying meals that could feed multiple family members. These cultural influences added variety and resilience to the otherwise limited diet, allowing families to maintain some connection to their heritage, even in the face of scarcity. Children's diets were particularly constrained. Many children were expected to contribute to household income through labor, leaving little time or energy for proper meals. Breakfast was often skipped or minimal, and lunch might consist of whatever could be carried to work or school. Malnutrition was widespread, leading to stunted growth, increased susceptibility to disease, and long-term health consequences. Despite these challenges, children often displayed remarkable resilience, adapting to the limited food available and finding ways to make it stretch further. Street vendors played a small but important role in the diet of the poor. Push carts sold inexpensive soups, bread, beans, and occasionally small cuts of meat or fish. These foods were often boiled or reheated on site, creating affordable meals for laborers and families who could not cook at home. Street food was not luxurious, but it was practical, filling, and allowed families to supplement their meager home-cooked meals. The reliance on simple staples meant that meals were often monotonous. Families ate the same foods day after day, week after week, with little variation. Leftovers were repurposed creatively to avoid waste, and meals were sometimes stretched over multiple sittings. Despite the lack of variety, these meals were essential to survival, providing the calories and minimal nutrition necessary to endure the harsh conditions of urban poverty. Lunch in 1800s New York was often the most inconsistent and challenging meal for the working poor. Unlike breakfast or dinner, which families could sometimes prepare at home, lunch was largely dictated by circumstance. Many laborers, factory workers, dockhands, and artisans spent the bulk of their day away from home, working long, grueling hours. They rarely had the luxury of returning home to a warm meal, and most could not afford to purchase food in substantial quantities while at work. For these families, lunch became a combination of practicality, necessity, and ingenuity. It was rarely a meal to enjoy. It was a meal to sustain energy and stave off hunger until the evening, when a more substantial dinner could be eaten at home. One of the primary sources of midday nourishment came from street vendors. New York streets were alive with pushcarts, food stalls, and peddlers calling out their wares. These vendors catered to the city's poorest residents, offering inexpensive, filling options like bread, beans, and soup. Bean soup in particular was a staple of street food. Prepared in large pots, often over open flames or portable stoves, it contained little more than dried beans, water, and occasionally scraps of meat or vegetables. It was cheap, hearty, and capable of stretching a small amount of meat across several servings. For many workers, a bowl of bean soup from a street vendor was a rare treat, both affordable and filling, giving them the strength to continue laboring for long hours. Soup in general was central to the lunch experience. While wealthier households enjoyed complex broths and well-seasoned dishes, the poor made do with simple concoctions. These soups were often watery, relying on the bulk of beans, grains, or root vegetables to provide calories. Meat, when available, was added sparingly, and sometimes just a bone was simmered to release flavor, which could then be stretched across multiple portions. Cabbage and onions were among the few vegetables frequently used, as they were relatively cheap and could last longer than other produce. For families who had access to small gardens, These vegetables might be homegrown, but in dense tenement neighborhoods, fresh vegetables were a rare commodity. Bread was another cornerstone of the poor lunch. Many families purchased a small loaf in the morning to carry with them to work. It could be eaten plain, torn into pieces, or soaked in soup to make it more filling. Leftover bread from breakfast or the previous day might be repurposed as a midday meal, either eaten as is or softened in water or broth. Bread was more than a food. It was a versatile tool for survival, capable of providing sustenance even when other ingredients were unavailable. For children and young laborers, a piece of bread or a small roll was often all that separated them from going hungry during the long hours away from home. For some, lunch was even more improvised. Families might pack small portions of leftovers from dinner the night before, potatoes, cabbage, or a bit of bean stew, wrapped in cloth or carried in small containers. This practice was common among immigrant families, who were used to making the most of what little they had. Italian families, for example, might carry small portions of polenta or rice with them, while Irish families often brought boiled potatoes or cabbage. The concept of convenience food as we know it today did not exist. Instead, every meal was prepared with care to ensure that nothing was wasted, and every bit of food could serve multiple purposes throughout the day. The economics of lunch also meant that many workers went hungry. When a family could not afford to purchase additional food or when leftovers ran out, workers simply had to endure hunger until the evening meal. Hunger was a constant companion for the poor, shaping not only their physical health but also their mood, productivity, and social interactions. Children attending school often went without lunch, sometimes eating only a small piece of bread or nothing at all. This widespread hunger contributed to malnutrition, stunted growth, and weakened immune systems, leaving the poor especially vulnerable to disease in a city where illness was rampant. Immigrant culture also influenced how lunch was approached. Many immigrant families brought culinary traditions that emphasized portability and simplicity. For German immigrants, bread and cheese or small sausages might be carried for lunch, providing protein and energy in a compact form. Italian immigrants often relied on grains, polenta, rice, or leftover pasta, combined with small amounts of vegetables or sauce to create a portable meal. Irish workers frequently carried potatoes, either boiled or mashed, as they were inexpensive, filling, and relatively easy to transport. These practices reflected a combination of necessity and cultural heritage, adapting old world traditions to the realities of life in a crowded industrial city. Street food was not only about sustenance but also about social interaction. Vendors and pushcarts created temporary community spaces where workers could gather, exchange news, and briefly escape the rigors of labor. A hot bowl of bean soup or a slice of bread from a friendly vendor was more than nourishment. It was a small respite, a momentary comfort in an otherwise harsh daily existence. Vendors themselves were often immigrants or members of the working poor, earning a modest income while serving those in similar circumstances. The relationship between vendor and customer was personal and reciprocal, built on mutual need and shared understanding of scarcity. Soup kitchens, which became more common later in the 19th century, also played a role in supplementing the midday meals of the poor. Charitable organizations, religious groups, and philanthropists occasionally provided free or inexpensive meals for the destitute, especially during economic downturns or harsh winters. These meals were simple, typically a thin broth, a portion of beans, or a small serving of porridge, but they offered critical sustenance for those who might otherwise go without food entirely. The presence of these institutions highlights the precarious nature of life for the poor, dependent as they were on a combination of self-sufficiency, community support, and occasional charity to survive. Water and beverages were also an important consideration. Safe drinking water was not always readily available, and poor families often relied on wells, communal pumps, or even contaminated sources, making hydration a daily challenge. Coffee, tea, or weak cocoa were occasional luxuries, often diluted or shared among several family members. Alcohol, particularly beer or cider, was sometimes consumed because it was safer than water in contaminated urban areas, though excessive consumption could exacerbate poverty by diverting scarce resources from food. Even within these constraints, ingenuity and adaptation were constant. Leftover vegetables from dinner might be boiled into a midday soup. Stale bread could be softened in water or milk to create porridge. Small amounts of fat, such as lard or drippings, were used sparingly to enhance flavor and increase caloric content. Herbs and spices were rare, but families often used what they could acquire cheaply to improve the taste of meals. Every decision about lunch, from portion size to ingredient choice, was informed by necessity, frugality, and survival instincts honed over years of hardship. The quality of food also varied depending on location and economic circumstance. Families living in poorer neighborhoods often had access only to the cheapest cuts of meat, the smallest portions of vegetables, and the most basic grains. Markets serving wealthier districts offered fresher produce, higher quality bread, and a wider variety of options, but these were typically inaccessible to the working poor. Seasonal availability also affected lunch options. Fresh vegetables were scarce in winter, and reliance on preserved foods, dried beans, and root vegetables increased. Children played a unique role in the midday meal dynamic. Older children might work alongside parents or as street vendors themselves, earning small amounts of money to buy food. They often carried small portions of bread or leftovers to eat during breaks. School-aged children who could not afford lunch might share with siblings or rely on neighbors for scraps. In some communities, informal networks developed where families pooled resources to ensure that no child went entirely without food, reflecting both the harshness of poverty and the resilience of communal support. Immigrant enclaves added additional layers of complexity to lunch practices. Neighborhoods were often organized along ethnic lines, and each group maintained its own culinary traditions. German neighborhoods might have small bakeries producing bread and pastries suitable for midday meals. Italian neighborhoods relied heavily on pasta, polenta, and simple sauces. Irish neighborhoods emphasized potatoes, cabbage, and occasionally salted fish. These cultural influences not only provided variety in an otherwise monotonous diet, but also allowed families to retain connections to their heritage in a foreign and challenging environment. The monotony of lunch often required creativity to make meals more palatable, reheating leftovers, combining different ingredients, and improvising with whatever was available were everyday strategies. Families learned to maximize flavor from minimal ingredients, turning small portions into more satisfying meals. While these adaptations did not eliminate the hardships of hunger, they allowed families to stretch resources and maintain a degree of dignity in the face of scarcity. For laborers, lunch was more than sustenance, it was survival. The physical demands of factory work, construction, and dock labor required energy, and inadequate food intake could lead to exhaustion, injury, and illness. Workers adapted by consuming whatever was available, relying on the caloric density of bread, potatoes, and beans to sustain them. Even a modest midday meal could determine whether a worker was able to continue laboring or succumb to fatigue, emphasizing the critical importance of food in the daily struggle of urban poverty. Dinner was the cornerstone of daily life for the poor in 1800s New York. Unlike breakfast, which was often minimal, or lunch, which was frequently skipped or eaten on the go, dinner was the meal that families gathered around at the end of a long day. It was more than just nourishment. It was a ritual, a moment to reconnect after hours of labor, and the only time the household could sit together to share what little food was available. Yet, even dinner was marked by scarcity, simplicity, and constant struggle. The poor could rarely afford variety or abundance, and each meal reflected both the economic constraints of the family and the broader social inequalities of the city. At the heart of a poor family's dinner table were boiled or baked potatoes. Potatoes were inexpensive, filling, and versatile, making them the backbone of countless meals. They could be boiled and eaten plain, mashed with a small amount of fat, or sliced and added to soups or stews. Their ability to satiate hunger cheaply made them indispensable. For Irish immigrant families, potatoes were not just sustenance, they were a symbol of survival, a reliable ingredient that could feed a family without breaking the budget. For German families, potatoes were combined with onions or cabbage, creating dishes that were simple yet satisfying. Even in households that could occasionally afford meat, potatoes remained a central component, stretching the meal and making it more filling. Bread, too, was essential at dinner. Purchased daily or baked at home when flour was available, bread served multiple purposes. It was eaten alongside stews or soups, used to soak up broth, or sliced thinly to accompany a small portion of meat or vegetables. In many cases, leftover bread from earlier meals became part of the evening meal, either softened in liquid or turned into a simple pudding or porridge. Bread was not merely food, it was a tool for survival, capable of turning a small amount of ingredients into a more substantial and filling meal. The reliance on bread underscored the repetitive nature of the poor diet, yet also highlighted the resourcefulness of families who could stretch every morsel to feed the entire household. Meat was a rare and prized addition to the dinner table. For most poor families, meat was a luxury reserved for special occasions, or when small scraps could be purchased from markets or received as charity. Salted pork was the most common, often boiled or baked to create a hearty but modest dish. Beef, when available, was typically a tough cut, simmered for hours to make it edible. Bones were frequently boiled to make broth, which could then be stretched across multiple meals. Fish, particularly salted herring or cod, was another occasional addition, though it was still considered a treat. The rarity of meat meant that many families relied primarily on potatoes, bread, and vegetables to create meals that could feed everyone, while meat served as an enhancement rather than the focus. Vegetables, aside from potatoes and cabbage, were scarce. Fresh produce was expensive, perishable, and often inaccessible to families living in overcrowded tenements. Cabbage was the most common vegetable, valued for its low cost, nutritional content, and ability to be preserved through pickling. Carrots, turnips, and onions were also used when available, often boiled into soups or stews to add flavor and bulk. Immigrant families with small gardens might grow tomatoes, beans, or herbs, but these were rare luxuries in the crowded urban landscape. Every portion of vegetables was carefully utilized. Leaves, stems, and even peels were repurposed into soups or mixed with grains to create additional sustenance. Dinner for immigrant families also reflected cultural traditions. Irish households often combined boiled potatoes with cabbage, creating a meal that was inexpensive yet hearty. German families incorporated sauerkraut, root vegetables, and small amounts of meat when possible, creating dishes that were flavorful despite their simplicity. Italian families relied on inexpensive grains such as cornmeal or pasta, sometimes combining them with tomato sauce or a small portion of cheese. These adaptations allowed families to maintain cultural identity while navigating the economic realities of life in New York. Dinner was a space where heritage and survival intersected, shaping the flavors and structure of meals in ways that reflected both necessity and tradition. Soups and stews were central to the evening meal. They were practical, versatile, and allowed families to stretch limited ingredients. Beans, root vegetables, and small scraps of meat were simmered together for hours, creating a dish that could feed multiple family members. Bread was often added to thicken the soup or soaked in broth to create a more substantial dish. The slow cooking process not only made tougher ingredients edible, but also maximized flavor and nutrition. In some households, leftovers from lunch or the previous day were incorporated into the stew, ensuring that nothing went to waste. These meals were modest, often monotonous, but they were essential for survival in a city where food scarcity was a daily reality. The communal aspect of dinner was also significant. Families gathered around a single table, often in a small, cramped apartment with limited lighting and ventilation. Privacy was minimal, and mealtime was a shared experience, reinforcing bonds and providing a brief respite from the challenges of the day. Children, who might have been working or attending school during the day, joined parents and siblings to eat whatever was available. Conversation was limited by fatigue and hunger, but the ritual of sitting together provided comfort and structure, creating a sense of normalcy in otherwise difficult circumstances. Evening meals were not without challenges. Cooking was labor-intensive, particularly in tenement kitchens that were small, poorly ventilated, and equipped with minimal utensils. Families often had to manage with a single stove or fireplace, preparing multiple components of a meal simultaneously. Firewood or coal was expensive, and cooking fuel had to be rationed carefully. Meals were prepared with an eye toward efficiency, ensuring that every ingredient was used and that nothing went to waste. In some households, one parent or older child took on the role of primary cook, while others assisted in preparation or cleanup, creating a cooperative effort that emphasized the importance of family teamwork in survival. Food preservation was also a critical concern. Without refrigeration, families had to rely on methods such as salting, pickling, smoking, or drying to extend the shelf life of meat, fish, and vegetables. Salted pork or fish could last for weeks, while pickled cabbage or root vegetables provided essential nutrients during the winter months. These preservation techniques shaped the flavors and textures of dinner, creating meals that were practical but often monotonous. Families became adept at balancing preservation with palatability, learning to season and combine ingredients to make them as enjoyable as possible within the constraints of scarcity. The scarcity of meat and fresh produce had direct health implications. Protein and vitamins were often lacking in the poor diet, contributing to malnutrition, stunted growth, and increased susceptibility to disease. Children were particularly vulnerable, as inadequate nutrition affected their physical development and immune systems. Adults also suffered from chronic deficiencies, which compounded the physical strain of long hours of labor. Despite these challenges, the poor demonstrated remarkable resilience, finding ways to create filling, nourishing meals from limited ingredients and making the most of every morsel. Dinner was also a time when ingenuity and adaptation were most evident. Leftovers from previous meals were incorporated into new dishes, scraps of vegetables were repurposed, and small portions of meat were used to enhance flavor rather than dominate the meal. Fat, such as lard or drippings, was used sparingly to increase caloric content and improve taste. Herbs, spices, or seasonings were rare, but families used whatever was available to add flavor to otherwise bland dishes. The focus was always on sustenance, stretching ingredients as far as possible while ensuring that everyone at the table received enough to survive. Immigrant influences were particularly pronounced at dinner. In German households, sauerkraut and potatoes provided both flavor and nutrients, while small amounts of sausage or meat added protein when available. Italian families incorporated pasta, grains, and simple sauces, often using leftovers from lunch or preserved ingredients to create dinner. Irish families relied heavily on potatoes, cabbage, and the occasional salted fish. These cultural traditions allowed families to maintain a sense of identity and continuity, even in the face of scarcity and hardship. Dinner became not just a meal but a reflection of heritage and adaptation to a challenging urban environment. Street vendors and markets also influenced dinner practices, though less directly than lunch. Families living near markets could purchase small amounts of fresh produce, bread, or fish to supplement their meals, while those farther from commercial centers relied more heavily on staples such as potatoes, bread, and beans. The cost and availability of ingredients shaped the composition of dinner, creating variations even within neighborhoods. Families learned to navigate these limitations, combining ingredients creatively to produce meals that were filling and as flavorful as possible under the circumstances. Children's roles at dinner were multifaceted. Older children might help with preparation, setting the table, or distributing portions, while younger children learned from observation and participation. Time was an educational experience as well as a necessity, teaching practical skills in cooking, resource management, and frugality. Children learned early how to stretch ingredients, preserve leftovers, and combine simple foods to create meals that could sustain the entire family. These lessons were vital for survival and shaped the next generation's approach to food, work, and household management. Dinner for the poor in 1800s New York was far from luxurious. Meals were simple, repetitive, and often monotonous, consisting of boiled potatoes, bread, cabbage, beans, and the occasional scraps of meat or fish. Yet these meals were critical for survival, providing the calories, protein, and minimal nutrients needed to endure the physical and social hardships of urban poverty. The careful planning, resourcefulness, and cultural adaptation that went into each meal reflect both the constraints and resilience of poor families. Even in the face of scarcity, dinner retained social and cultural significance. It was a moment to gather, share, and preserve traditions. It was a test of ingenuity, a demonstration of frugality, and a reflection of the broader social and economic realities of 19th century New York. The poor learned to make the most of what they had, transforming meager ingredients into meals that, while simple, could sustain life and maintain a sense of dignity in a city where survival was never guaranteed. For the poor of 1800s New York, sweets and indulgent treats were a rare luxury, often unattainable for most families. In a city where survival was a daily struggle and the cost of food dominated every decision, sugar, candies, cakes, and pastries were not staples. They were extravagances, enjoyed only on special occasions, and even then sparingly. The diet of the working poor was dominated by bread, potatoes, beans, rice, and occasional vegetables, forming a monotonous but necessary source of sustenance. Sweets existed largely in imagination or in fleeting moments of celebration, but their scarcity tells us much about the realities of urban poverty, the social hierarchy, and the ingenuity required to endure. Sugar, the main ingredient in most sweets, was expensive relative to the wages of laborers. A family earning only a few dollars a week could not justify purchasing sugar when it could be spent on potatoes, bread, or beans, foods that provided essential calories. Even small quantities of sugar were highly prized and carefully rationed. Households might sprinkle a pinch into porridge, use it to sweeten a rare cup of tea or coffee, or bake a small cake for a holiday. These small indulgences were treasured, marking special events like birthdays, religious holidays, or significant family celebrations. For the children, such moments were magical and rare, a sharp contrast to the otherwise bland and repetitive meals that defined daily life. Candy, similarly, was a luxury few could afford. Street vendors sold simple sweets such as hard candies, toffees, or small cakes, but the prices were prohibitive for the average working-class family. Children might receive a piece of candy only on Sundays, when a parent returned from work with a small treat, or during religious festivals like Christmas or Easter. These brief encounters with sweetness were powerful experiences, remembered fondly, and talked about in stories passed among friends and siblings. The rarity of candy and sweets heightened their value, making them symbolic of reward, comfort, and celebration in a life otherwise dominated by scarcity. Cake and baked goods were another form of indulgence. Large cakes were nearly impossible for poor families to afford, as ingredients like flour, sugar, butter, and eggs were expensive and often rationed. Some families managed to bake small loaves or simple cakes, using leftover flour, water, or scraps of fat to create a dessert for special occasions. These cakes were far from the rich confections enjoyed by wealthier households, but they represented a moment of joy and normalcy. Even a simple spice cake or boiled pudding could serve as a centerpiece for a family celebration, and its preparation often involved the participation of all members of the household, reinforcing family bonds and cultural traditions. The scarcity of sweets was intertwined with broader dietary limitations. The poor diet of the working-class population lacked variety and essential nutrients. Meals were repetitive and calorie-focused, designed to sustain energy rather than provide pleasure. While potatoes, beans, and bread provided bulk and calories, they offered limited vitamins and minerals. Vegetables were often scarce, meat was infrequent, and fresh fruit was a luxury. The lack of dietary diversity contributed to widespread malnutrition, affecting both children and adults. Deficiency diseases such as rickets, scurvy, and anemia were common, reflecting the challenges of surviving on a monotonous, limited diet. Malnutrition had profound effects on the urban poor. Children were particularly vulnerable, often showing signs of stunted growth, weakened bones, and susceptibility to illness. Adults also suffered, with reduced physical resilience, fatigue, and compromised immune systems. The combination of labor-intensive work, limited food, and poor living conditions created a cycle of hardship that was difficult to break. For many families, even the smallest indulgence, such as a pinch of sugar or a piece of bread pudding, represented a crucial psychological and nutritional boost in an otherwise harsh existence. The ingenuity of the poor was evident in how they attempted to incorporate sweetness and variety into their meals, despite scarcity. Leftover bread might be transformed into a simple pudding, sweetened with a small amount of sugar or milk if available. Porridges could be enhanced with scraps of fruit, molasses, or honey, creating a modest but satisfying dessert. Families became adept at repurposing leftovers and combining minimal ingredients to stretch the pleasures of food as far as possible. This resourcefulness reflected both the limitations of their circumstances and the human desire for comfort and enjoyment, even in the face of poverty. Seasonal availability influenced the presence of sweets and special foods. During harvest seasons, families might have access to fresh fruits such as apples, pears, or berries, which could be eaten raw, baked into simple dishes, or preserved through drying or cooking. Preservation methods were essential, as the cold months brought scarcity and limited access to fresh produce. Dried fruits could be stored and used to enhance porridge or simple puddings, adding a touch of sweetness that was otherwise rare. These seasonal treats provided both nutritional value and psychological comfort, breaking the monotony of the everyday diet. Immigrant communities brought their own culinary traditions to the preparation of sweets, though adaptations were always constrained by cost. Irish families might prepare simple boiled puddings or bread-based desserts, using minimal sugar and incorporating potatoes or grains to stretch ingredients. German families introduced pastries, cookies, and sweetbreads, though these were often simplified or made in small quantities to suit the family budget. Italian immigrants relied on grains, dried fruits, and honey or sugar to create modest desserts that could feed a family without depleting resources. These cultural adaptations allowed families to retain connections to their heritage while navigating the limitations of urban poverty. The social dimension of sweets was also important. Sharing even the smallest treat with neighbors, siblings, or friends could create a sense of community and solidarity. In crowded tenements, where families lived in close quarters and resources were limited, small indulgences became a shared experience. A pinch of sugar in porridge, or a small piece of bread pudding, might be divided among several children, creating moments of joy and cooperation that contrasted sharply with the scarcity and hardship of daily life. These small gestures reflected both necessity and human creativity, as families sought ways to enhance their quality of life despite economic constraints. Holidays and religious celebrations were the most common occasions for sweets. Christmas, Easter, and other religious festivals provided an opportunity for families to purchase or prepare small treats that were otherwise unaffordable. Simple cakes, sweetened porridges, or small candies became focal points for celebrations, allowing families to create rituals and memories, even in the midst of poverty. These occasional indulgences reinforce cultural and religious identity, offering a sense of continuity and hope in an otherwise challenging environment. Scarcity shaped not only the presence of sweets, but also the broader approach to food and meal preparation. Families developed habits of frugality, careful planning, and resource management. Leftovers were never wasted, scraps were repurposed, and every ingredient was used to its fullest potential. Fat from meat or cooking drippings might be saved to enhance bread or porridge, while dried fruits and vegetables could be rehydrated and incorporated into stews or puddings. This resourcefulness was a hallmark of survival for the urban poor, highlighting both the limitations of their circumstances and the resilience required to endure them. Health and nutrition were constant concerns. The limited diet of the poor left them vulnerable to deficiency diseases. Rickets, caused by a lack of vitamin D, was common among children, leading to bowed legs and skeletal deformities. Scurvy, resulting from insufficient vitamin C, caused bleeding gums, fatigue, and general weakness. Anemia, often due to low iron intake, further compromised energy and physical resilience. These conditions were exacerbated by the repetitive low-quality diet, which provided calories but lacked essential nutrients. Even small additions of fruit, vegetables, or sugar could make a meaningful difference in overall health, though such items were rarely accessible. The psychological impact of scarcity and limited diet was profound. Hunger, monotony, and deprivation shaped the daily experiences of the poor, influencing mood, behavior, and social interactions. Children often learn to endure hunger from an early age, developing resilience, but also experiencing frustration, fatigue, and stress. Parents faced constant anxiety about providing enough food, balancing the needs of multiple children, and making choices between nourishment, rent, and other necessities. Even small indulgences, such as a pinch of sugar or a piece of bread pudding, could provide comfort, relief, and a temporary sense of pleasure in an otherwise harsh reality. Community networks played a critical role in mitigating scarcity. Neighbors, extended families, and immigrant communities often shared food, exchanged ingredients, and helped one another during times of need. These informal networks allowed families to stretch resources, access occasional treats, and maintain some level of stability in their diet. Sharing a small dessert or dividing a piece of bread pudding could create moments of connection and solidarity, highlighting the social as well as nutritional importance of food in the lives of the poor. Even in the face of hardship, the poor demonstrated remarkable creativity and adaptability. They developed techniques for making the most of limited ingredients, repurposing leftovers, and creating modest pleasures from minimal resources. Porridges could be sweetened, breads transformed into puddings, and scraps incorporated into soups or stews. These strategies reflect both the limitations imposed by poverty and the ingenuity of families determined to provide sustenance, comfort, and a sense of normalcy for their children. Malnutrition and scarcity were intertwined with labor and urban life. The physical demands of factory work, construction, and other forms of manual labor required energy, yet the limited diet of the poor often left workers exhausted and undernourished. Children were expected to contribute to household survival through work or assistance in meal preparation, further emphasizing the intersection of labor, scarcity, and nutrition. Even modest additions to the diet, such as a small sweet treat or an occasional piece of fruit, could provide both physical and psychological relief, enhancing the ability of families to endure daily challenges. In many ways, the scarcity of sweets and indulgences highlights the broader social inequalities of the time. While wealthier families enjoyed a wide variety of foods, including sugar, pastries, and fresh fruit, the poor had to subsist on a repetitive, limited diet that prioritized calories over taste or pleasure. This disparity underscores the role of economic status in shaping daily life, health, and social experience, offering a window into the harsh realities of urban poverty in 19th century New York. Despite these challenges, the poor displayed resilience and adaptability. The careful management of resources, creative use of ingredients, and occasional indulgence in sweets reflect a determination to maintain dignity, culture, and comfort, even in the face of hardship. These strategies highlight the human capacity to endure, innovate, and find moments of joy, even when circumstances are extremely difficult. By the time evening fell in the crowded streets and tenements of 1800s New York, the day for most poor families was far from over. Laborers had returned from long hours of work in factories, workshops, or docks, exhausted and weary from physical exertion that tested the limits of the human body. Children had either been working themselves or had endured long school days, often on empty stomachs. In these households, dinner was not merely a meal, it was a lifeline, a ritual, and in many ways, the only moment of the day when families could come together and reflect on the day's struggles. Yet even as the poor gathered around their meager tables, the realities of scarcity, social inequality, and deprivation remained ever present. Understanding what these families ate, and why, offers us a window into their resilience, ingenuity, and the stark divide between the haves and have-nots in one of America's fastest-growing cities. The meals themselves were simple, repetitive, and often monotonous, yet they were imbued with a deeper significance. A bowl of beans, a few boiled potatoes, a piece of bread, or a small portion of cabbage might appear unremarkable today, but for families living hand-to-mouth, these ingredients represented survival. Every morsel was measured, rationed, and often stretched over multiple meals to ensure that everyone received at least the bare minimum of nourishment. Hunger was a constant companion, and families developed strategies to maximize what little they had. Sobers were creatively repurposed. Bread soaked in broth could serve as a second meal. Vegetable scraps could flavor soups or stews, and tiny portions of meat or fish were combined with grains to create the illusion of abundance. These culinary practices, born out of necessity, reflected both the physical and mental resilience required to endure urban poverty. The social dynamics surrounding food were as critical as the food itself. Meals were communal experiences, bringing families together in cramped apartments with little privacy or comfort. The kitchen, often a single room serving multiple purposes, became the center of daily life. Parents and older children assumed responsibility for cooking, cleaning, and rationing, while younger children learned by observation and participation. Even within these constrained spaces, meals provided a moment of connection, a chance to share news, discuss challenges, or simply enjoy a rare moment of calm. Food, in this sense, was more than sustenance. It was a vehicle for family cohesion, cultural preservation, and emotional survival. Immigrant communities played a central role in shaping these mealtime practices. New York streets, tenements, and neighborhoods were vibrant with ethnic enclaves. Irish, German, Italian, Jewish, and Eastern European families lived in close proximity, bringing with them culinary traditions that both reflected heritage and adapted to the realities of scarcity. Irish families relied heavily on potatoes and cabbage, often enhancing them with small portions of salted fish or pork. German families incorporated bread, root vegetables, and sauerkraut, sometimes adding scraps of sausage or meat when available. Italian families relied on grains such as cornmeal and pasta, often combining them with tomato sauce, cheese, or preserved vegetables. These adaptations were not merely about taste. They were strategies for survival, ensuring that each family could stretch ingredients to feed multiple mouths while maintaining cultural identity. The role of children in this ecosystem was both practical and symbolic. Children often participated in meal preparation, learning skills that would be vital for their survival as adults. They helped gather ingredients, prepare vegetables, tend small gardens if available, and assist in cooking. They also learned the crucial lesson of resource management, how to make a small amount of food last for an entire family, how to reuse scraps creatively, and how to ration portions equitably. These early lessons shaped a generation capable of enduring hardship, yet they also reflected the harsh realities of urban poverty, where childhood was often truncated by responsibility and necessity. Nutrition, or the lack thereof, was a constant concern. The poor diet of these families provided calories but often lacked essential vitamins and minerals. Protein intake was low as meat was rare and expensive, and fresh vegetables and fruit were limited by availability and cost. Malnutrition was widespread, contributing to diseases such as rickets, scurvy, and anemia, which weakened bodies and reduced resilience. Children were particularly vulnerable, with stunted growth, skeletal deformities, and increased susceptibility to illness common in overcrowded tenements. Adults, too, suffered from the cumulative effects of poor nutrition, long hours of physical labor, and exposure to unsanitary living conditions. Food scarcity was not just an economic issue, it was a public health crisis, shaping the longevity, strength, and overall well-being of the city's poorest residents. Despite these hardships, the poor exhibited remarkable ingenuity in stretching limited resources. Meals were carefully planned, leftovers repurposed, and ingredients combined in creative ways to maximize both sustenance and flavor. Bread, potatoes, beans, and rice were the staples, but these humble ingredients were transformed through boiling, baking, mashing, or soaking. Small additions of fat, such as lard or drippings, enhanced caloric content and improved palatability. Leftover meat bones were simmered to make broth for soups or stews. Vegetables, often limited to cabbage, onions, carrots, or turnips, were used to flavor and bulk out dishes. Every decision in the kitchen reflected careful calculation, balancing taste, nutrition, and quantity to ensure that no food went to waste. The role of street food and vendors was also significant, even if indirect for dinner. While lunch was more commonly purchased outside the home, access to fresh bread, vegetables, or small cuts of meat from local markets influenced what families could prepare for the evening meal. Families living near markets or vendors had a slight advantage, being able to supplement their basic ingredients with fresher or more varied options. Those farther from commercial centers had to rely more heavily on staples and preserved foods, highlighting the inequalities even within the poor communities themselves.
Sweets, treats, and special foods played a symbolic role in these meals.
Although rare, a pinch of sugar in porridge, a small piece of cake, or slice of dried fruit represented more than flavor. They were markers of celebration, cultural identity, and psychological relief. Holidays, birthdays, or religious observances provided the rare opportunity to incorporate these indulgences into dinner. They offered moments of joy, a break from monotony, and a reminder that even in scarcity, families sought pleasure and ritual. The careful rationing of such luxuries also reflects the resourcefulness and resilience of these households, making the occasional treat a meaningful event rather than a daily expectation. Community networks were central to sustaining poor families through scarcity. Neighbors shared food, exchanged ingredients, and assisted one another during times of need. Tenement living fostered close relationships, with families often pooling resources or sharing meals to ensure that everyone had enough to eat. These informal support systems were critical, particularly for families with children, the elderly, or those temporarily without work. Sharing food was both practical and social, reinforcing bonds of solidarity and mutual aid that helped mitigate the harsh realities of urban poverty. The psychological dimension of dinner cannot be overstated. In a city dominated by industrialization, labor exploitation, and economic inequality, Food was a source of comfort, identity, and hope. The act of gathering around the table, even for a simple meal, provided structure, routine, and a sense of stability. It allowed families to reflect on the day, share news, and support one another. In households where parents were exhausted from work and children were hungry, dinner was a rare moment of connection and emotional sustenance. The importance of these meals extended beyond nutrition. They were integral to maintaining family cohesion, cultural continuity, and emotional resilience. Immigrant traditions further shaped these meals in ways that reflected both heritage and adaptation. Irish, German, Italian, and Eastern European families modified traditional dishes to fit the limitations of urban poverty. Boiled potatoes, cabbage, and beans were transformed into hearty stews or simple casseroles. Bread was incorporated into puddings or soups to stretch portions. Leftover meat and bones were simmered to extract flavor and nutrients. These adaptations reflect not only resourcefulness, but also the human desire to maintain cultural identity and familial continuity in the midst of economic and social hardship. Labor demands directly influenced the composition of dinner. Workers returning from long shifts required calories to sustain their energy, yet meals were often limited by cost and availability. Dinners were carefully balanced to provide the maximum sustenance with minimal expenditure. Children who had been working or attending school needed nourishment to grow and develop, and parents prioritized allocating portions equitably. The labor-intensive nature of both work and cooking reinforced the importance of dinner as a moment of survival, reflection, and family cohesion. Health, scarcity, and community combined to make dinner both a challenge and a ritual. Meals were a site of negotiation, resourcefulness, and adaptation. Families had to navigate fluctuating prices, availability of ingredients, and the physical limitations imposed by fatigue and illness. Yet, despite these obstacles, the poor developed sophisticated strategies to ensure that each meal provided sustenance, comfort, and a sense of normalcy. Dinner became an act of resilience, a daily testament to human ingenuity in the face of adversity. Even with the limitations of the diet, families found ways to infuse meals with meaning. Seasonal vegetables, preserved fruits, or small amounts of fat enhanced both nutrition and taste. Cultural practices informed preparation and consumption, from German sauerkraut and bread dishes to Italian polenta or rice casseroles. Holidays, religious observances, and family rituals allowed for occasional indulgences that broke the monotony of everyday meals. These moments, though rare, reinforced identity, community, and hope, showing that even in poverty, people sought to preserve dignity, pleasure, and continuity. The scarcity of food also emphasized the inequalities of urban life. While the wealthy dined on fresh meat, imported fruits, and a variety of rich dishes, the poor subsisted on a repetitive diet of bread, potatoes, beans, and occasional vegetables or scraps of meat. This contrast was not merely economic, it shaped health, longevity, and social opportunity. Malnutrition and poor living conditions limited the physical and cognitive development of children, constrained labor capacity, and perpetuated cycles of poverty. The humble dinners of the poor reveal the broader social and economic forces at play in New York, highlighting both hardship and resilience. In many ways, the story of Dinner for the Poor is a story of survival, ingenuity, and humanity. Families learned to stretch ingredients, repurpose leftovers, and create meals that were both filling and culturally meaningful. Community support networks helped families weather scarcity, while occasional treats and holidays provided moments of joy and psychological relief. Dinner was not merely a meal. It was a reflection of resilience, adaptation, and the human capacity to endure in the face of extreme hardship. By examining these meals, we gain insight into the lived experience of New York's working poor. We see how economic inequality, immigrant culture, labor demands, and urban living shape daily life. We understand the challenges of scarcity, malnutrition, and limited opportunity, and we witnessed the ingenuity, community spirit, and determination that allowed families to survive, maintain cultural identity, and preserve a sense of dignity even in the harshest conditions. Ultimately, the humble dinners of 1800s New York tell a larger story, a story of survival in a rapidly changing city, of families who adapted to extreme hardship, and of the human capacity to find meaning, connection, and resilience even in the face of scarcity. These meals, simple though they were, serve as a lens through which we can understand not only the diet of the poor, but also the social, cultural, and economic fabric of a city undergoing rapid industrial transformation.